Greetings, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine as of March 4, 2025. A lot has happened today, so let's get started. Let's begin with the United States, from where perhaps the most important and interesting news has come in the past 24 hours. Since the morning, many American officials have made statements regarding Ukraine, Zelensky, elections, and other topics. To sum up what was said by U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, House Speaker Kevin McCarthy, and Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen, we can conclude that the U.S. is no longer planning to allocate any more money to Ukraine, neither for economic support, nor for the restoration of energy infrastructure, nor, even more so, for continuing the hostilities. It can also be inferred that if Zelensky and Ukraine want to restore normal relations with the U.S., they must travel to Washington and sign an agreement on rare earth resources. However, at the end of their statements, the Americans added that they would prefer to do business not with Zelensky, but with someone else, any new leader of Ukraine who would be more negotiable and willing to do business. These statements started coming from across the ocean this morning. By the evening, former U.S. President Donald Trump made a rather curious post on his social media. He wrote just 2 sentences which, if translated into Russian, would read as, "Tomorrow night will be big. I call things as they are." The second part is quite difficult to translate, as its meaning remains somewhat unclear. However, the first phrase, "Tomorrow night will be big," immediately sparked a lot of discussions. Now, everyone is guessing what might happen on Tuesday evening. Many began to speculate on this topic, as there has been active discussion in recent days about a potential meeting between Trump and Putin. Perhaps tomorrow will be the day for that meeting. Or maybe Trump is hinting that Zelensky has indeed made a decision and will head to Washington to sign the agreement. Alternatively, Trump might unexpectedly announce that Canada is becoming the 51st state of the U.S., or Greenland is joining America. Or perhaps he will announce airstrikes on Mexican drug cartels. In any case, it is still completely unclear what he meant, but the tension is rising. If you ask my opinion, I would consider Trump's statement a classic poker bluff. He is pretending that he has a strong card in his hand to analyze the reactions of his opponents, Europeans, Russians, Chinese, Mexicans, Canadians. Based on their reactions, he will decide whether it is worth continuing the game and how justified his efforts and resources are. Now, let's move on to London, where many interesting statements have also been made. Of course, let's start with what Zelensky said. He stated that he does not intend to leave the presidency, as this matter should be decided by the Ukrainian people. He also noted that if the West wants to remove him, there are 2 options: either accept Ukraine into NATO, or start negotiations with him, as it won't be easy to just remove him. Not only should they prevent him from running for a second term, but they also need to convince him to withdraw from the elections. Whether anyone will negotiate with him is a complicated question. But this is how Zelensky views the situation. However, this is not the most important statement from the summit in London. The key document discussed there was the Franco-British peace plan for resolving the conflict in Ukraine. This plan consists of 2 points. The first point, a ceasefire declaration and a limited ceasefire for 1 month. This ceasefire includes a ban on airstrikes, sea strikes, and attacks on energy infrastructure. This is the so-called Plan A. According to the UK and France, if both parties, Ukraine and Russia, can hold off from combat for 1 month, the next step would be the deployment of Western troops, British and French, along the line of contact or at other strategic points. After this, they envision a long-term peace between Ukraine and Russia. According to the Franco-British plan, hostilities along the contact line do not necessarily have to stop during the first month of the ceasefire. Of course, the plan sounds very interesting, a kind of attempt to separate the parties on both sides of the ring. But there is one important point. The first phase of the plan, ceasefire and limited cessation of hostilities for 1 month, implies that it will be perceived differently by the parties. For example, after the publication of this plan today, Western countries suggested that Zelensky make a gesture of goodwill, meaning he should unilaterally declare a ceasefire first. Zelensky would have to address the nation, state that Ukraine is tired of fighting, and announce that, according to the Franco-British initiative, The country is entering a ceasefire mode and will observe Russia's reaction. In this way, Ukraine could allegedly test whether Russia is truly committed to peace and a ceasefire. But there is a catch. Let's break down the first month of the ceasefire. This is a moratorium on airstrikes, sea strikes, and attacks on energy infrastructure. If we analyze each of these aspects of warfare, it becomes clear that Ukraine essentially has nothing to lose. For example, if Ukraine has been striking Russian territory, the last such attacks were back in December. For 3 months now, it's 2025, there have been no news of Storm Shadow, Scalp, or ATACMS strikes on Russian territory. So, even if Ukraine announces a ceasefire on airstrikes, it wouldn't change anything for them, since they have not been conducting active attacks anyway. The plan also suggests halting attacks on energy infrastructure. However, Ukraine has not been making significant strikes on Russian energy infrastructure. If anything happens, these strikes are minimal, rare, and do not cause substantial damage. At the same time, Russia clearly understands that each subsequent strike on Ukraine's energy system could lead to its complete collapse. Furthermore, the US recently declared that it would no longer help Ukraine restore its energy infrastructure, either with funds or spare parts. Thus, each new Russian strike could become critical for Ukraine. Regarding naval strikes, the situation is as follows. If we look at the situation in the Odessa region since the beginning of 2025, most strikes on port infrastructure, including those in the Danube River areas, the towns of Reni and Izmail, were carried out by Russia. There are many videos and reports of explosions online. Furthermore, there was recently information that Russia launched a missile strike on a ship belonging to the UK but sailing under the flag of Panama. According to the Daily Mail, this ship was transporting weapons for Ukraine, and the strike destroyed a large batch of weapons. The British side is extremely dissatisfied with this incident. Thus, if a moratorium is introduced on naval strikes, Russia is essentially limiting itself from attacking military targets in the Black Sea and the Odessa region. To summarize, when Zelensky is proposed to unilaterally declare a ceasefire regarding airstrikes, naval strikes, and attacks on energy infrastructure, he essentially loses nothing, as Ukraine has no such capabilities right now. However, if Russia accepts this ceasefire, it will completely close the possibility of striking Ukrainian logistics, allowing Ukraine to receive weapons from Europe and the UK without hindrance. Meanwhile, publicly, it will appear that Zelensky made concessions, and Russia will likely refuse, which will create the image of Russia as a country wanting to continue the war, while Zelensky supposedly seeks peace but cannot achieve it. We will wait for Tuesday evening to see what exactly Trump will attempt to convey. But there is one nuance. If we carefully analyze the conditions of this ceasefire, it becomes clear that Ukraine has practically nothing to lose. The last attacks on Russian territory with Storm Shadow, Scalp missiles, or other means have not occurred for several months. Essentially, even if Ukraine officially announces the cessation of airstrikes, nothing will change for them. They simply have no such capabilities. The same goes for strikes on Russian energy infrastructure. If they occurred, their scale was minimal. Meanwhile, for Russia, this ceasefire means significant restrictions, as strikes on Ukraine's energy system play a crucial role, and the West has already declared that it will no longer help Ukraine in its restoration. Naval strikes are also an important component. Most of the attacks in 2025 were aimed at port infrastructure in Odessa and the Danube. The recent incident with the British ship, which allegedly carried weapons for Ukraine, only heightened tensions. If Russia agrees to the ceasefire, it will essentially close itself off from striking military facilities and infrastructure in Ukraine, giving Kiev and its allies the freedom to supply weapons without hindrance. Thus, the offer for Zelensky to unilaterally declare a ceasefire looks like a favorable political move. Ukraine formally agrees to ceasefire but loses nothing. Russia, if it agrees, will be forced to stop attacks on key objects, which will strategically weaken its position. Publicly, it will appear that Zelensky seeks peace while Russia does not. In the eyes of the international community, Ukraine will be seen as the side that wants to end the conflict, while Moscow will be portrayed as the aggressor refusing to compromise. Now, we'll just have to wait for Tuesday evening. Perhaps we will hear new statements and find out what steps key players in this political drama will take.